I think there's something very important going on in the economy today, in business today. And it's sometimes things move so fast, it's difficult to understand what's going on. Now, I'm a writer. That's what I do for a living. And writers try to wrestle, words and ideas together and make them march in a straight line. But one of the most annoying things about being a writer, and there are many annoying things about being a writer, one of the most annoying things about being a writer are people who say, well, that's nice, Dan, but a picture is worth 1,000 words. Okay. So, after 4 decades of this, into my 40s, I finally came up with a rebuttal. And the rebuttal is, yeah, two-part rebuttal, yeah, well, a picture may be worth 1,000 words, but a metaphor is often worth 1,000 pictures. And I think that there is a metaphor that explains what's going on in the economy and in business today. And this is the metaphor right here. It's our brain. Now, you notice something about this brain. I know that we're in a business school, not a medical school or neuroscience school, but this is an amazing thing, this brain. Your brain, my brain. I can give you a quick tutorial about what it's all about. This is the frontal lobe, the temporal lobe, the parietal lobe. This back here. Anybody know what this part back here is? Good. Who said that? Somebody over here said cerebellum. No one's admitting it? See, if this were the United States, okay, every hand would have been up. All right? Gosh, I love this country. This is the cerebellum. This is the pituitary gland. In here you'll find the amygdala. Anybody know what this is, right here? What? Very good. Hypothalamus. The hypothalamus regulates what neuroscientists call the 4 Fs. The 4 Fs. Fighting, feeding, fleeing, and mating. Now. But you notice something else about this brain. That it is divided into 2 equal halves, the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. And that is the metaphor that I'm talking about. I think there is here's the punchline of what I've been working on for the last 2 years. I think that the scales are tilting, okay? The abilities that used to get you ahead are characteristic of this hemisphere of the brain. The abilities that now get you ahead are characteristic of this hemisphere of the brain, okay? But in order to understand that, because there's so much bad stuff written about left brain this and right brain that, I went and got my brain scanned in order to understand what it's about. And I wrote about it in the first chapter of the book. And it's actually a remarkable experience getting one's brain scanned. Remarkable experience. And so you sit back in this, MRI, and you have a little clicker in your hand, and it's actually very primitive at this point. In order to see the images they show you, they jury-rig a little kind of mirror up here, and it looks out to basically a slide screen. And so they gave me a whole bunch of exercises to recognizing faces, recognizing scenes, and I had to ask me questions. I had to click the answer with this little clicker I had in there. And so you end up and you go out there and you see on a computer screen your brain, which is a remarkable thing to see one's own brain. Remarkable and at least somewhat disappointing. Remarkable because it's like, oh my God, that's my brain. There's a picture of my brain. Disappointing because my brain looked like basically every other brain I'd ever seen. I thought my brain would be cooler looking or something. So I was getting I came out of the brain scan to understand the differences between the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. And I came out of there and there was a technician. I have to sort of act this out a little bit. Okay, there's a technician. Okay, here's the computer screen. I'm standing over here. The technician is looking at the image of my brain. And she starts tapping some keys, turning some dials here. And then she looks up at me. All right. Okay, so I'm now basically on the phone to my wife saying I have to go into surgery in the next 10 minutes, all right? Looks up at me again. Finally she says, "You have a big brain." So I'm, being an American and being a man, I'm totally psyched by that. Until she explains to me that there's absolutely no correlation between brain size and intelligence. And she very sort of slowly explained to me that intelligence is really it's kind of like population. And brain size is sort of like geography or square miles. And what you want is a really thick, robust population, it doesn't really matter how much territory it covers. Okay? Then on the way home, I said, oh my God, this woman, said that my brain was like the U.S. state of Montana. There's like lots of area, but not much going on inside of it. So, but I did understand the differences between the left side and the right side of the brain, and those sides offer us a very convenient metaphor for what I think is going to take to succeed. The left side is rational, analytical, sequential, spreadsheet-like, zero in on the right answer. The right hemisphere is, to some extent, artistic, to some extent, empathic. It is more simultaneous, that is, it takes things in at once rather than sequentially. It is more about context than about text. It is much more about synthesis than analysis. It is much more about artistry and empathy than it is about cold, logical, deductive reasoning, zeroing in on the right answer. And that's what's going on in the economy today. The scales are tilting. The abilities that used to get you ahead, these kind of left brain abilities, rational, analytical, logical, linear abilities of accountants, of lawyers, of engineers, still absolutely 100% necessary, but no longer sufficient. And the scales are tilting so that a set of abilities that we've often overlooked and undervalued are becoming the ones that are really make or break in business. Now, Rotman has figured this out before everybody else. That's why they have a Center for Integrative Thinking, okay? Center for Integrative Thinking is basically a, synonym of a whole new mind. You need both sides, but these two sides, metaphorically, the right side is the first among equals. And these abilities of artistry and empathy and inventiveness and seeing the big picture and play and pursuing meaning, those are the abilities that are going to matter most in your individual careers and in the course of your organizations. There's some people, you make this argument that you're moving from a world where the scales are tilting away from these rational, analytical, spreadsheet, linear abilities to a world of artistry and empathy. Okay? Sometimes, certain designers and certain artists will look at you and say, that makes intuitive sense to me. In the meantime, all the accountants and engineers in the audience are, silently mouthing a, 8-letter, 2-syllable barnyard epithet. So I think it's important to explain it, as Brian's suggesting, in a kind of a left-brain way.
The other day when I was getting ready to talk to Dan, I saw on a website an ad from a Canadian company looking for public relations practitioners to go work for this Canadian company, except to work in that Canadian company's office in India. So I punched in 200,000 Indian rupees, which is what they were offering, and it translated to $5,714.45. And then I punched it in 2 days later when I made the slide, and it was up 3 cents. So we're competing on price with Asia for the same kind of job that a Canadian could do, can be done in Asia by an Asian. So that's problem number one, is they have smart people too who can do the same work we can for a whole lot less.
That's a big part of it. They're really, there are three forces that are tilting the scales away from these left brain abilities, making them necessary but no longer sufficient, and more toward these right brain abilities, okay? And I'm a pretty left brain guy, okay? I am pretty analytical, I'm pretty numerate, I'm pathologically anal retentive, I'm a writer, and I look at evidence, and the evidence is just incontrovertible that this is happening. And you got to look at the three things that are making this happen, and they are, what order do you want to do them in? Asia, abundance, automation?
Let's move to the next slide, which is automation. And the picture is Northern Telecom 10 years ago, when we thought we had the automation here and that would take care of your jobs. And the next shot is a machine that's being used in Asia. So not only do we have to cope with automation, but automation's moved to a less expensive place. But tell a little bit about the impact of automation.
Yeah, well, these three forces, abundance, Asia, and automation, are tilting the scales. Here's why automation is tilting the scales. Let's talk about automation for a second, okay? Because we've seen this movie before. The last generation, machines proved that they could replace human backs, okay? Human muscle. That's what we saw in manufacturing, that there were certain things that machines could simply do better than we could. Well, we're seeing the same thing happening in certain kinds of white-collar professions today, okay? Accounting and law and even medicine. That is, computers can do certain kinds of left brain tasks Calculation, zeroing in on the right answer, analysis, decision trees, simply better than we can. And I'll give you a couple of examples of this. I mean, there's a metaphorical example here. Many of you know the John Henry story from the United States, where John Henry's a steel driving man, and he's a guy who hammers through mountains, and strongest man in the workforce. And one day, a steam drill owner comes to the work camp and says, "I've got a steam drill that's stronger than John Henry." And everybody says, "There's no way you could possibly be stronger than John Henry." And they said, "Well, let's have a race." And so they have this race. John Henry on one side, the steam drill on the other side, to see who can bore through the mountain fastest. Now, remember who won that race? You got a 50-50 shot. John Henry won, but he died, and that became a parable for this lost way of life in North America, that machines could do things better than we could. Well, you want to know who the modern John Henry is? Garry Kasparov, the greatest chess player of his generation, one of the greatest chess players of all time. Why? In 1987, Garry Kasparov said, mid-1980s, they're developing computers that can play chess. 1987, Garry Kasparov says, no computer will ever beat me. Okay? Over time, Kasparov gets a little bit better, and computers get a lot of bit better. Okay? So Kasparov can look at a chessboard and analyze, in the space of 2 minutes, 10 possible scenarios. Which is actually a remarkable intellectual achievement. 10 possible scenarios. Okay, I can barely remember which way the horse moves, let alone do something like that. Okay, a computer is a little bit faster. You know what a computer can do in those 2 or 3 minute period? How many? 1 million. Higher. 1 billion. Lower. How about right in the middle? Yes! 500 million calculations, scenarios in that 2 minutes time. Okay, 500 million versus 10. Okay, that's not a fair fight anymore. So Kasparov today says, at a certain point we'll never be able to beat computers. Why? Because chess, at a certain level, the right brain aspects of chess is about calculation, about memory, about zeroing in on the right answer. And so, automation is in many ways John Henrying certain kinds of white-collar professions. Let me give you an example. If you're an accountant, any of you accountants here? If you're an accountant doing somewhat routine work, a lot of work that accountants have done has been taken by TurboTax. I mean, if you think about automation, again, certain kinds of functions can be automated, okay? So if you're an accountant, you face competition to some extent from TurboTax and other kinds of software. You also face competition from a $500 a month Indian chartered accountant, okay? And so if you even look at automation in a practice in something like law, okay? Law is the sort of thing that we thought is impervious from any kind of automation, impervious from any of these forces. My parents told me to go to law school. I made the terrible mistake as a young man of going to law school. Although I met my wife, so it dramatically increased my earning power in a sort of random way. And I didn't and it was no surprise, I never practiced law. I actually did very poorly in law school. I probably shouldn't admit this in the halls of the academy here, but I did not do very well in law school, to put it mildly. I actually graduated in the part of my law school class that made the top 90% possible. But the reason my parents told me to go to law school was that it was immune from all these forces. But today, even certain kinds of legal work can be automated. Okay, let me give you an example of that. Let's say you want to get, and the laws are going to be different here and then in the United States, but in the United States, let's say you want to get an uncontested divorce. Okay, you go to get an uncontested divorce in the United States, it's going to cost you $2,000 or $3,000 US. But an uncontested divorce is very simple. It's not complex. It's uncontested. No one's arguing about anything. They just want to get away from their spouse. Okay? So what does it amount to? It amounts to doing work. It amounts to filling out the forms properly and conveying them to the proper legal authority. Okay? It is very routine work. And that's one question. That's one answer to Brian's question. Here's the word any of you young people or not so young people should be running away from, screaming at the top of your head. Routine. Any work that is routine, that can be reduced to a script, to a spec sheet, to a set of instructions, to a set of rules, that kind of work can increasingly be outsourced or automated. And so, you go to something like law, okay, the practice of law, you go to a place like, if you don't want to spend $2,000, $3,000 on an uncontested divorce, you can go to a website called CompleteCase.com. CompleteCase.com, where you can get an uncontested divorce for $249. And so that automates the legal function. Now, on engineering, it's an interesting thing because if any kind of engineering that is routine, okay, that is simply following the steps on a spec sheet, following the set of rules, zeroing in on the right answer, that kind of work is in big trouble. Because an engineer, a well-trained engineer in India or the Philippines or elsewhere can do that kind of work for significantly less. Now you have, ever so slow trend of certain kind of radiology capable of being done in India and elsewhere. I refer to India only because I think it's the most robust example of what's going on here. Also, I've been fortunate enough to spend a fair amount of time there. And so you have folks, certain kinds of radiology, certain kinds of CAT scans, certain kinds of X-rays are relatively routine, relatively simple. And so you can outsource those. And U.S. hospitals are sending CAT scans and X-rays to India. So, radiology, I'm not so sure. Certain kinds of medicine, and medicine is caught up in certain kinds of regulatory issues and other kinds of pressures. But if to succeed as a doctor, you need some measure of analytical ability, obviously, but you also need to understand other kinds of more right-brain things. And so what's going on in medical schools in North America is quite fascinating right now. You have a move, for instance, at the Jefferson School of Medicine in Philadelphia, they are training doctors they're measuring doctors in empathy. Empathy. They have this guy's laughing at the very notion of a doctor being empathic. They're measuring students' empathy. It measures on empathy. Now, that's a very interesting findings from this instrument. It's called the Jefferson Scale of Physician Empathy. Very interesting findings from this. They're finding that there's a very nice correlation between empathy scores and patient outcomes. Big surprise. Okay? And once you get past it, because once you get past a certain threshold of analytic ability, you're going to be able to be an okay doctor on the functional analytic stuff. But the point of differentiation is often these more right brain empathic abilities. There's also a move in American medical schools in something called narrative medicine, where they're training doctors to understand patients' stories. Why? Because diagnosis is partly linear, analytical, left brain, but also very much caught up in narrative. So these are medical schools, okay? You cannot get to a larger, sort of more ferocious bastion of left brain, good grade muscle flexing than medical schools. And here they are teaching, so you have medical schools now where young doctors are keeping what are called parallel charts. So they'll keep the quantitative, logical, linear information on the patient's chart, but they'll also write a narrative about getting to know that patient. Now, it sounds preposterous, but, this is being taught in some ways, it's being taught in medical schools. There are medical schools that, 50, 60 medical schools now in North America have courses in spirituality. The UCLA Medical School in Southern California has a doctor overnight program where these medical school students get, what do you call it when you go to a hospital? Admitted to the hospital with fictitious ailments and get to understand what it's like to be a patient. Why? To get them to deepen their empathy. So, without empathy and storytelling ability and the ability to see the big picture, I think some kind of doctoring work is going to be outsourced or automated. Let's go back to standardized tests, which is more of an obsession in the United States than in Canada. These standardized tests measure purely this kind of rational, logical, linear right answer ability. They are really about getting the right answer, and that's fine. You need to know this stuff. I want to emphasize that. You need to know that. You need to be adept at that stuff. But it's no longer enough. So in the United States, we're absolutely obsessed, fixated in a pathological, perverse way in need of therapy on the SAT. The Scholastic Aptitude Test. We're obsessed with that. But all that measures is these kind of logical, linear, reductive, deductive, right answer abilities. Now, there's a guy at Yale University who has created a new Scholastic Aptitude Test. He calls it the Rainbow Project. There's a psychologist at Yale named Robert Sternberg. And what Sternberg has done is created a new set of questions, a new test for students. Here's what it looks like. Here's some of the things from the test. You get a blank New Yorker cartoon, and you have to write a caption. You get a title, The Octopus's Sneakers, and have to write a short story. You're given a scenario. You got to help your friends move. You got to convince somebody to lend you something. How are you going to do that? Now, it turns out, okay, those are all seemingly important life skills, but here's the thing that's so amazing about it. That test turns out to be a better predictor of college performance than the SAT. Okay, so I'm not a big fan of standardized. I'm not a huge fan of standardized tests. Now, CHAD is called the Charter High School for Architecture and Design. Charter High School for Architecture and Design. And one of the big abilities, again, in this tilt from the left to the right, one of the key abilities is design. Okay, and Roger Martin, I mean, to his credit, is so far ahead of every other business school dean on this. I mean, Roger has said, I mean, it is a statement so emphatic and incisive that it should be, you know, on a coin somewhere. Okay, he said, business people don't need to understand designers better. They need to be designers. He's a business school dean. Okay, he's not an MFA dean. Business people need to be designers. I think design has become as important, a design sensibility, a design literacy has become as important in business as the ability to use Microsoft Excel. You obviously need to use Excel, but if you're not design literate, you're going to be in a world of hurt. Now, there's this, oh, there you go. Wow. See? Another victory for the forces of technology over cynicism and despair. Let's say who is Bob Lutz? Who is Bob Lutz? Bob Lutz is this auto industry legend, okay? And Bob Lutz is not a touchy-feely guy. Okay? Bob Lutz is a former U.S. Marine. He's 70 years old. He's 70 years old. He's a white-haired white man. He does not believe global warming is real. He thinks global warming is a myth peddled by the environmental movement. Okay? This is not a touchy-feely guy. So he takes over. Can you go back one? He takes over a top job at General Motors. And they say, how's your approach going to differ from your predecessors? And here's what he says. It's more right brain. I see us being in the art business. Excuse me? Art business? General Motors? And then he says, you know, art, entertainment, and mobile sculpture, which coincidentally happen to provide transportation. Okay, wait a second here. Let's think about this. Now, GM is not an insignificant company in the world, or certainly the American economy. GM, this is another startling factoid, or if you're a nerd, like me it is. GM is responsible for 1% of U.S. GDP. A single company, okay? This is not a little kind of boutique design firm here, okay? Which is actually part of the problem, but that's another story altogether. This is General friggin' Motors, okay? It says, and it's not like some crackpot in the design department. It's like one of the top guys saying, oh, we're in the art business. Okay, when General Motors is in the art business, we're all in the art business. Okay, the way the book is structured, I mean, is as follows. The first third of it makes the argument that these three forces, Asia, abundance, automation, are tilting the scales away from these logical, linear, left-brain abilities more toward these artistic, empathic, right-brain abilities. The second two-thirds of the book talks about the 6 abilities that matter most in this economy. Design, story, what I call symphony, empathy, play, and meaning. And then at the end of each of those chapters, on design and story and sympathy and empathy, symphony and empathy and play and meaning, there is a section of what I call the portfolio, which is set off by the shaded pages. See, very nice, very sort of smart design here. So people, if you just want the takeaways, you just like skip the hard wrought prose and keen analytic thinking, and just go straight to the punchline here and there are all kinds of tools and tips and exercises and things. Abundance, okay? Another thing tilting the scales away and actually sort of, you know, ratifying a lot of stuff that's going on at Rotman. It's politically incorrect to say this, but you're not supposed to say that the United States, in particular, North America in general, is just spectacularly wealthy and prosperous. But the United States in general, in particular, and North America in general, is spectacularly prosperous. I mean, we lose sight of that sometimes. I think elite opinion loses sight of that. The standard of living in the United States, the standard of living in Canada, is breathtaking. Breathtaking by historic standards, by international standards. If you were to take the median American household, okay, the median American household, and somehow, you know, go back in time, get into a time, this is a complicated experiment, okay? You find the median American household, okay, that's step one. Step two, you find a time machine, okay? You go back in time, you were to take somebody from, say, the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, and transport them into the home, the life, a week in the life of the median American family. they would be blown away. They would say, oh, this has got to be one of the richest, most prosperous people in the whole society. You say, no, that person's dead in the middle. If you look at consumer goods, if you look at the fact that in America, 2 out of 3 people own their own home, we have more cars than people. I mean, an array of these startling factoids. My favorite startling factoid for this world of abundance is, which is less of an issue here in Canada. Are you familiar with self-storage? Basically, self-storage is a business, an industry devoted entirely to housing people's extra crap. All right? Self-storage in America is a I don't have the figures for Canada. Self-storage in America is a $17 billion a year business. The self-storage industry in America is larger than the motion picture business. Okay? It's startling, isn't it? That is what I mean by abundance. And so abundance, as Rotman has figured out, as Roger Martin has figured out, is change the stakes. That is, you can't sell a product, a service, an experience that is merely functional, it simply works. You have to sell something that appeals to the right side of the brain, to an aesthetic sensibility, to a narrative sensibility, to a spiritual sensibility, to an emotional sensibility. And to me, the apotheosis of all of this is apotheosis is like in the United States, it's like one of those SAT words. You know, everybody learns for the SAT, and I very rarely use it in conversation. The apotheosis of all of this is really the toilet brush. Okay, and if you read Virginia Prestrell's terrific book, The Substance of Style, she talks about designer toilet brushes. Okay, here's the most kind of mundane utilitarian object in the world, and yet it's now being designed by these great product designers and even by these great artists. And she talks about in this book this kind of arms race of designer toilet brushes, where you can get a $5.99 Michael Graves toilet brush at Target, but you can get a $100 toilet brush or a $250 toilet brush or some kind of Lexus of toilet brushes. And again, so you can't sell anything that is merely functional. It also has to have this more kind of aesthetic or spiritual or emotional appeal. And that's why designers, I think, and Toronto is an incredible design city, designers, I think, are very, very well placed in this kind of economy. Different aspects of play. We tend to think of business as something that's very, very sober, very, very serious. And in fact, the opposite ability becomes enormously important, again, in a world of abundance. So you see something like video games, okay? Video games. If you're over 35, you don't get video games. If you're over 35, find someone under 35 to explain them to you. Enormously important. The United States Army is using a video game as a recruiting tool. Video game industry is a giant industry in the U.S. throughout North America. It's not as big as self-storage, but it's getting there. It's also teaching young people a very different way of thinking about the world, a very different kind of grammar, a very different vocabulary. And one of the most interesting things about video games, I think, is, and I wish this were my point, I really do. I wish I had figured this out, but I didn't. And it's a point I got from this pretty interesting book, a very interesting book called Got Game. Harvard Business School Press came out about 6 months ago, Got Game. And these two authors make the point that one of the great things about video games in terms of young people is that in video games you fail. You can't get good at a video game without failing. And the truth is, anybody who wants to achieve any kind of proficiency in his or her profession must fail. It's essential. You can't achieve mastery without failure. But what is the one thing our school system and to some extent our business culture wants to scrub out more than anything else? Failure. And so these guys are making the point that the sort of comfortableness with failure is one of the lessons that these video games are teaching kids. Another aspect of play is also, I described a visit to these laughter clubs in India where people get together every morning at 6:30 in the morning and laugh. And it turns out that laughter has a physiological effect. There are laughter clubs now all over the world. They're migrating to the workplace. I even had the idea of, any Rotman student here can steal this idea, okay? I have this idea of a discount management consultancy. Okay, discount management consultancy, and here's how it would work. I think that if you go into an organization, walk through the hallways, if people are laughing, it's probably a pretty good place to work. They're probably doing pretty cool stuff. Okay, so I would charge $10. Okay, walk through and say, are they laughing? You guys are in good shape. Are they not laughing? Thumbs down. It's not, for $10, you're not going to get McKinsey, but you're going to get this, you're going to get this thing. And it turns out that humor ends up being important in management, ends up being important in relating to people, and ends up being something that is a social lubricant. and it ends up being enormously important, and it's undervalued. So in fact, actually, and I don't know if Roger wants to steal this idea from his colleagues at the Owen School of Management at Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt, I don't know if you read about this, Vanderbilt is in their, they have an elective in kind of presentation. You guys have something like, presentation communication skills, and they're having kids do stand-up comedy routines. Okay, that's in business school. Do you like it? Next year at Rotman, fall semester. Sign up now.